You never want a serious crisis to go to waste.
The U.S.'s democracy has been downgraded 3 times since 2016.
I am listed as a domestic terrorist. You have 48 hours to get your information and you're gone.
Whoever wins those elections can basically do whatever they want.
If you want to fight against the country, you need an F-15. You need something a little more than a gun.
The people who tend to start civil wars are the groups that...
Welcome back for another video. I'm Rob and this is Sigma 3 Survival School, where it's our job to increase your survivability. Today I'm going to cover a super controversial topic, the kind of topic that honestly gets you censored and canceled. We're going to talk about the hypothetical scenario of revolution or civil war in the US. And my primary objective in this video is to talk about the logistical realities of war. We have a lot of keyboard warriors talking about resistance in this country, but most don't understand the logistics or likelihood of success of said resistance. With the popularization of the modern Minuteman on social media, I thought it prudent to discuss whether that idea was even plausible logistically. In the US, we're a gun culture, we love fighting, and the tactical community has made it cool for people to run around and full battle rattle and do overt military training like the Army. But do civilians really have the logistical capabilities to sustain such operations? That's the question I want to pose to you. In this video, we're going to cover the following major areas of interest: whose side would the police and military take, food, weapons, money, history of insurgency success, communications, and existential threats. And make sure you hang around for the conclusion, where I outline how the history of such actions have always led to the downfall of empires. And if you're new here and you don't know what I do for a living, I essentially teach people to survive indefinitely in the wilderness and urban environments, tactical skills, escape and evasion, as well as herbal medicine. Now, I've trained more civilian survival instructors than anyone in the world, and I run the longest existing civilian SEER program in the country. But before we get started on any of the logistics of revolution, I want to first let an expert on civil wars speak on the subject, and you can hear her thoughts. The full clip of this video will be down in the description below.
I'm going to talk about a threat that most people don't want to think about. It's too frightening, and it doesn't seem real. That threat is civil war. In 2017, I was asked to serve on a task force run by the CIA called the Political Instability Task Force. The task force was comprised of 2 types of people: experts on civil war like myself and data analysts. The experts came up with 38 different factors that they thought could potentially lead a country towards civil war, and some of those factors seemed obvious. It turns out that only 2 factors were highly predictive, and they weren't the ones the experts expected. The first was whether a country was an anocracy. Anocracy is just a fancy term for partial democracy. It's a government that's neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic. It's something in between. So think about Hungary today. Hungary holds elections. Hungarians eagerly go out and vote. It's just that whoever wins those elections can basically do whatever they want. The second factor was whether citizens in these anocracies had formed political parties around identity rather than ideology. So rather than joining a party because you were liberal or conservative, capitalist or communist, you joined a party because you were black or white, Christian or Muslim, Serb or Croat. If a country had these 2 features, the task force considered it at high risk of political violence and put it on a watch list. The U.S.'s democracy has been downgraded 3 times since 2016. Between December of 2020 and early 2021, the United States was officially classified as an anocracy. We also know who tends to start civil wars, and again, it's not the people most of us think. It is not the poorest people in society. It is not the people who are most oppressed by their government. The people who tend to start civil wars, especially ethnically based civil wars, are the groups that had once been politically dominant but are in decline. The United States is in the midst of a major transition from a country whose population is majority white to a country whose population will be majority non-white. The first thing we have to do is address the 2 big risk factors of civil war: anocracy and identity politics. I've interviewed a lot of people who have lived through a civil war, and they all say the same thing: I didn't see it coming. But there's no reason why we, the democracy-loving people of this world, can't create our own playbook to prevent civil war. We have to be brave enough to fight for real democracy, strong democracy, because only by fighting for democracy can we ensure that we will truly get peace.
Now, this lady leans way left, but she also advises the White House and Congress on domestic terrorism and civil war threats. And she's embedded and interviewed all kinds of revolutionary organizations all over the world for over 30 years. So her experience is irrefutable on the subject of internal conflicts. And she made some interesting points that stood out that people should probably listen to. Top one being that the disaffected population in decline that has lost power is the one that is most likely to cause civil war. And she pointed out that it was likely white people. Now, we all know that the government has been labeling white supremacy and domestic terrorism as the #1 threat in the US for years. Veterans and people that have served this country are also deemed as top threats.
Okay. Give me a gun, I'll shoot you, son of a.
A competitor in my industry, Mike Glover, and his disaster aid organization was listed along with Oath Keepers and 3%ers as top domestic threats by the FBI. He's a Special Forces veteran, CIA contractor, and spent his entire career fighting terrorists. He even went on Joe Rogan to speak about it. Here are his words.
So how did it come up that this was being labeled by the government as potential terrorists?
When Kyle Seraphin, he's the FBI agent who leaked the documents of militant violent extremists, MVEs, and determined that we were extremists and labeled us so. When he did that, he contacted Facebook. The FBI contacted all these social media platforms. My company account got shut down from Shopify. Shopify said, you have 48 hours to get your information and you're gone. So a multi-million-dollar business, gone. They call me a white supremacist, and I'm walking on eggshells.
So you today are listed as a domestic terrorist.
A domestic, on Facebook, which translates to Instagram, I am listed as a domestic terrorist. If you probably put in Mike Glover, domestic terrorist, a couple articles will launch. They had pictures of me and a whole bunch of people in Heber City, Utah, where my headquarters is at. In those pictures, we were doing community events, raising money for charity. And they were calling, they said, like, Green Beret, teaching militia, all these different tactics. I'm an entrepreneur running a business, trying to live my best life, and I want to be left the fuck alone. And now I'm being labeled a domestic terrorist by the same organizations I worked with and for.
And no advocating whatsoever about trying to overthrow the government or attacking people or taking back your rights or storming the Capitol. Nothing, zero. All of it is about being prepared for natural disasters, for the grid going down, something happening where you have to protect yourself or your family. That's it.
That's it.
And if anybody learned anything during the pandemic, they should have learned that we have a fairly fragile civilization. If the grid goes down, if a natural disaster happens, if something goes sideways, look, with a disease that kills a very small amount of people, shut the entire country down. And it wrecked the economy and fucked up a lot of people's lives. And we didn't learn from that. We didn't learn, like, hey, you know, maybe we should have some food stored. Maybe we should have some contingency plan. Maybe we should have a full tank of gas always when we park our car at night so we can get out of town. Maybe we should have, you know, firearms or, you know, fishing poles, like fucking something. The idea that nobody can look at that people can't look at that and go, oh, this isn't domestic terrorism. This is just smart. This is just being prepared for disaster. This is being prepared for worst case scenario. The idea that being prepared for a bad case scenario makes you a terrorist is fucking nuts. That's really crazy.
Crazy that this is the world we've come to, where the government's labeling patriots that love our country as domestic terrorists. I even know an Army Ranger that got on a no-fly list for some really non-controversial Facebook posts he made 10 years ago that had nothing to do with anti-government stances. But these are the kind of people that the government is listing as potential threats. So ask yourself, why is that? Why choose patriots as the #1 threat? Well, when you think about their agenda, almost all of our politicians in power believe in global government. They're all members of the WEF, CFR, and other globalist organizations pushing one world government agendas. And who would be the #1 domestic threat to that agenda? A well-armed and regulated militia of people that are disaffected and lost their power in politics. Now, I don't think anyone disagrees that globalism is their agenda. They've been in the news talking about it openly for decades. Hell, Joe Biden even wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal many years ago called How I Came to Love the New World Order. The article's been scrubbed from the internet, but you can search online and find articles talking about the article that he wrote. In order for global government to exist, you must first remove major opponents to such an order, such as China and Russia. Hence the ramping up of war rhetoric with them since him taking office and surrounding them with US bases and military equipment. And you must disarm the civilian populace that would resist you domestically for this agenda to move forward unimpeded. Because you can't fight foreign superpowers if you have problems domestically with revolt. We all know their number one objective is disarmament. This is chess, not checkers, folks. Their agenda is no secret. They speak plainly about it. But the point of this video is to discuss the logistics and history of resistance to that type of tyranny and contemplate whether or not such resistance has any chance of success. So let's dig into it. The most common theme I hear discussed among people debating this subject is they think the military and police will jump to the side of the revolutionaries because they tend to lean that way politically. But just name a time in history when that's happened. What you see historically is that there's always people willing to back tyranny. They're going to choose the side that has the winning hand and will look to maintain their status quo within society, and typically won't risk their paychecks and food source. Power is a luring drug, and there's always those who will seek to back the most powerful hand, either because they believe in it or they don't have a choice. Look at every major dictator in the last 100 years, and they were always able to find willing bodies to enact their bloody vision on the world. Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Castro, you name it. Most people have this delusion that other people think like them. But for every person that believes revolution is the answer to our political problems, there is a person that has the exact opposite view. And then there's a whole bunch of people in the middle that just want to keep the matrix in order.
Do we have a deal, Mr. Reagan?
You know, I know this steak doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it is juicy and delicious. After 9 years, you know what I realize? Ignorance is bliss.
And when you have an autocrat or an anocracy power in control, they will control the narrative and any information around that event. And by default, there is always a group of people that will buy into that narrative even when evidence doesn't support it at all. So any event that could trigger a revolution or civil war would be spun in a manner to make attackers look like the bad guys and them look like the good guys. All dissenting information would be silenced. Just look at January 6th as an example. It was spun as a violent insurrection compared to be worse than September 11th. Even though the only people that were killed were unarmed civilians, and all the videos released to the event showing 90% of it was totally peaceful, with police allowing people into the Capitol and ushering them around. But despite all of that, half the country still believes it was a violent insurrection. People often talk about a zombie apocalypse in the prepper community, but most people don't understand what the term really means. Zombies are the sheep who will go along with the status quo. Even in the revolution, a large percentage of the country still sided with Britain. These are the same kind of people that turned on others for not wearing a mask during COVID or not taking the shot. Regardless of your opinion on that subject, sides are always drawn, and there will always be people who are easy to sway based on propaganda. Those of you who don't buy into the mainstream narrative are in the minority. Any revolution or civil war would be just like an insurgency, and when you look at the success rates of insurgencies against major powers, successful examples of triumphant insurgencies are almost non-existent. It's hard to find any modern historical example of any insurgency toppling a major government and installing something better than before. Tell me down in the comments below of any examples that you can think of. Any insurgent excess you can find is almost always deposing a dictator, only to replace it with something just as bad or worse. What it tends to do is throw the country into massive disarray, causing more issues than it solved in the first place. What tends to happen is that if an insurgent force gets success, it's not typically due to winning major battles. They tend to just outlast their opponents, causing total decay of that society, and they win by default and not through strategic victory. Now, some might throw out our own revolution as an example of success, but that was a foreign invader, where the populace had manufacturing capabilities and food self-reliance, and the enemy had a massive ocean as a barrier to their supply line. A foreign invader is very different than a domestic civil war between government and civilian populace. When a civilian populace is united against a foreign threat, they can be very powerful, but when a populace is divided domestically, it's a much different story. Not to mention the chaos within a nation among its people vulnerable to foreign invaders, which we'll cover in the existential threat section of this video at the end. The number one thing any fighting force needs, even above ammo, is food and water. And I want you to ask yourself, how many friends and family members do you know that are totally food self-sufficient? I don't just mean having some beans and rice in their basement that will get them through a few months, because a revolution or insurgency can last a decade or more. Our own revolution was 7 years long and the Civil War was 4 years. The Taliban had to resist us for 20 years. I'm talking about long-term, indefinite ability to produce food as well as feed other people in their community. Ask yourself, how many people in this society would be totally screwed if Walmart went down? And if they can't feed themselves or their families, whose side do you think they will take? Do you think they will take the side of the revolutionaries or the government with total control of food and supplies? Let me know what you think in the comments below. In recent decades, all control of food has been consolidated into the hands of a few major conglomerate corporations that control almost all the food that we consume. And we've all seen how in the last few years how food plants are mysteriously being burned or destroyed with no plausible explanation of why those events happen.
Devastating processing plant fires. Back in April, a massive fire at Salinas, California broke out in the key agricultural region where tens of thousands were forced to evacuate their homes.
This shows the alarming rates of fires at manufacturing plants, grocery stores, food pantries, farms, and grain factories. It's likely that over 100 of these fires have taken place just this year. Just this month, the Grain-Kraft flour mill in Pendleton, Oregon was completely destroyed, and even tens of thousands of chickens were killed in a May fire in Minnesota. Let's look at the manufacturing fires alone. The black markers show that this is happening across the country. Now let's see the grain map. Oregon, Washington, and Pacific Northwest appear to have taken a hit, as well as the Midwest. And as far as farm fires go, let's look at these green markers appearing in droves from Minnesota to Wisconsin, Michigan, and all down the East Coast. Now there has been a lot of conspiratorial discussion.
But you kind of write it off. It's not that big of a deal. Accidents happen. But when you've got well over a dozen food processing plants and warehouses getting destroyed or seriously damaged over just the last few weeks, at a time when the food supply is already vulnerable, it's obviously suspicious.
I think we all learned a valuable lesson during COVID. We learned just how fragile our food system is. The machine goes down for even a few days, food shelves are empty because for the last 30 years, government has consolidated all food control into a handful of companies that control all the grain and meat in the US. On top of that, our entire industrial agriculture system is completely dependent upon chemicals, fossil fuels, and a steady flow of energy to keep it going. And at any given time, there's only enough food in storage for 8 days to stock the shelves in the US and approximately 8 pounds of meat per person in storage. If that goes down or the system stops working due to revolution, nobody eats except preppers and survivalists, the kind of people with stockpiles and skills to live off the land. But those people are in the extreme minority, and even if you are totally food self-reliant, you aren't sufficient enough to feed all the fighters who aren't. And in order to fuel a fighting force, you need sustainable food sources or outside countries giving supplies to the fighters, none of which is available in the US. That being said, a lot of people in the tactical community are running around getting every piece of cool guy gear they can get their hands on, doing training in full battle rattle so that they have the skills to resist tyranny. And, you know, I guess there's nothing wrong with that training, but I'd bet over 99% of them don't even have the capabilities to feed themselves long term. They put overt gun skills above survival, farming, and subsistence skills. Why? Because those skills are sexier, more fun, too much Call of Duty, and not enough practical skill set preparations. I mean, to give you perspective on calorie needs for a fighter, a 150-pound person carrying 50 pounds of gear moving 4 miles per hour burns 500 calories per hour. So I think most people are putting the cart before the horse. If you're purchasing NVGs and have a ton of guns, but don't have the skills to live off the land or farm your own food, you're already combat ineffective. If you look at historical examples of insurgencies in recent modern history, they were all food self-reliant, and almost no one in the US is. So for long-term sustained combat operations, this is a major problem. The next most important thing a fighting force needs is a steady flow of weapons and ammunition, and this is another area where a few corporations control a majority of all production of these items. Want to take a guess on whose side they are on? For example, 1/3 of all 5.56 ammo in the US is produced by Lake City Ammunition, and it's a government-run facility. The US government is the largest purchaser of military-grade equipment in the world by landslide numbers. I mean, we spend more money on the military than the next 10 countries combined. Now, we definitely don't have any lack of small arms arms in this country, but what happens every time a mass shooting or a new government regulation for gun control is on the books? The store shelves go dry within 24 hours. Now, there's lots of people stockpiling ammo, but I can guarantee you it's not enough for a multi-year sustained resistance. In order for true resistance, you need manufacturing capacity or supplies from outside resources. And in the case of the revolution of the US, first thing the government will do is to move to control the entire ammunition supply. The other consideration we need to think about is that every single insurgency in modern history had more than small arms in order to fight. If you compare weapon systems of insurgents around the world in comparison to US citizens, the Minuteman pales in firepower comparison. Now, you may have NVGs and AR-15s, but they had RPGs, RPKs, IEDs, and they didn't even make a dent in the US fighting force in our 20-year wars with them. They couldn't even manage to kill more of us than the Nazis killed in a couple of days during major campaigns of World War II. There's no example in modern history of any power being defeated by insurgencies, and definitely not with small arms alone. I mean, look what's going on in Palestine right now. The insurgents there have been preparing for decades, and they're getting their clock absolutely clean in a very short period of time.
Right now, you can't go out and buy an automatic weapon. You can't go out and buy a cannon. And for those brave right-wing Americans who say it's all about keeping America's independent and safe, if you want to fight against the country, you need an F-15. You need something a little more than a gun.
Now, I don't agree with this guy on anything, but he ain't wrong about this. You simply can't take out the greatest superpower in history of the world with an AR-15. It's fantasy to believe you can topple a superpower with a backpack and rifle. I mean, just ask yourself how many men it would take to take out a single Bradley fighting tank with an AR-15. Next, we need to talk about money. No fighting force can exist very long without money, and since money has gone almost completely digital and all digital transactions are tracked, how do you suppose anyone would have the financial means to oppose the tyranny that controls all the food and money? And with implementation of the digital currency coming very soon, literally no one will have cash at all. They've been slowly consolidating power amongst the most important assets for resistance: food, money, information, arms, and they've already made it against the law to purchase in many European countries anything over $1,000 in cash. Western democracies are seeking to totally remove the ability of its citizens to purchase anything without their knowledge. So if they have control of the food, the information, and all cash flow, how do you combat that? Are you going to go down to your local store with Bitcoin or silver and gold? I think not. Now, some people would argue the barter system would be in place, but unless you produce food, weapons, ammo, or other useful supplies outside of your own stockpiles, what do you really have to barter with? Let me know in the comments below. For any fighting force to be successful, they need good ways to communicate. There are three main systems that they would use to communicate, to include radio comms, phones, and internet. Any group must have short and long-range communications to be able to organize amongst different groups within their organizations. Now, there are large groups of radio organizations in the US, but most of these groups are dependent on the grid being attached and functional, and many of those systems are intertwined with government systems. I'll post a video in the description below that outlines the real-world uses of all the available radio systems and explains them, really in depth. Radio will simply not be enough to communicate, and security would be difficult or impossible to regulate. There's also the issue that most encrypted types of comms are gatekept by the government, and it's restricted for a lot of different civilian uses. Not to mention that the government has the amazing ability to completely jam all of those abilities in their entirety, as well as track the location of any type of signal. Phones, of course, could be used to communicate, but that is also a source that could be cut off at any time with the flip of a switch. Not to mention the non-secure status of those calls. Let's look at Israel and Palestine for example. They were able to completely cut off all communications within 24 hours, and any comms that were still available were being monitored for intelligence for strike targets. Western military is extremely good at signal intelligence, and it's how they gather most of their intel for airstrikes and raids. There's also the internet, but the internet's broadly monitored, censored, and controlled by a few handful of corporations. Most internet is transmitted by fiber optic wires, and the data in those wires can be completely downloaded and monitored in their entirety. I used to know a government contractor that designed software systems that linked the intelligence agencies with the fusion centers. And if you don't know what fusion centers are, they are located in each state and coordinate intelligence sharing operations between federal and state authorities. And if you've ever wondered how, when there was an attack or a mass shooting, that police already have a complete history and profile of that person and have it released within hours, the fusion centers are what make that possible. They have a file profile on everyone and use that data in order to coordinate search efforts for criminals. Now, oftentimes the Minuteman mindset isn't at all about the intention of revolution or resisting tyranny. Many people train tactics because they just love doing it. They want to be prepared Minutemen in case of a foreign invasion or SHTF type scenarios. But the probability of foreign invasion is almost none. The Japanese in World War II realized this was an impossibility and only sought to cripple our Navy in the Pacific so that we couldn't thwart their invasion efforts in the Philippines.
眠れる巨人を起こし、奮い立たせる結果を招いたも同然である。
They knew the invasion of the US was impossible. There's a 6,000-mile gap between our enemies and us, and you'd need to completely obliterate the entire US Navy in its entirety to make that even a thought. And since we have the most powerful Navy in the history of the world by a landslide, it isn't very plausible at all. China nor Russia has the capabilities to make any of that a reality short of large-scale nuclear attacks, and even then an invasion would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Occupying a territory so large as ours with such vast distances between your supply lines isn't really doable. But the one instance where it might be possible is if the US were engaged in a huge civil war among its populace. If we were busy fighting amongst ourselves, then we would be divided and weak, and if we were going to be invaded, that would be the time to do it. A crippling nuclear strike on our Navy might be enough to take them out of the fight, given China the ability to invade. While I think this is improbable, it's really the only possible way they might be able to gain an advantage. China just doesn't have much in the way of long-range capabilities with their Navy, and Russia doesn't have the seaports or ships capable of mounting an amphibious type invasion either. So, just not to mention that their Navy must sail by all of our allies before they even get to us. Russia's really also no threat to us other than within its nuclear capabilities. While anything's possible, it's logistically improbable. So if food, money, ammo, communications, and many other necessities of warfare are unavailable to revolutionaries, how can they win? I'm not trying to provide you any answers. I just want to pose the question of whether such an action is plausible or has any reasonable chance of success. And even if there was success behind such actions, would the country be a better place for it? I'll leave that answer up to you. As far as where I stand personally, I'm 100% against the idea of revolution or civil war because I believe it would be the end of us as an empire. Political division amongst ourselves makes us weak. Politicians in control that are dividing us among these party lines would love a giant crisis because it would be just the catalyst they need in order to enact their control agenda.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
Now, if America did fall into civil war, any rights you had before most certainly would be gone after that incident was settled. They would have all the justification they needed for a Chinese-style tyranny we can already see in the works now. We are the United States for a reason, and our unity is what gives us our greatest strength. Divided, we are weak, and with all the terrible geopolitical policies and actions we've done in the last 20 years, most of the world hates us. And with the world amassing its military resources against us, we absolutely must remain united or we will fall. Civil war is not an option, revolution is not an option, it would be the ruin of our empire. All nations fall for very specific reasons throughout history, and they're usually all the same reasons. Ray Dalio, a world-renowned economist, outlines these subjects in his books and videos on the changing world order, so let's hear his words on the subject.
I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years, and the last 3 reserve currencies, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
As Ray outlines, there are very specific reasons that all great empires fall, and it's always the exact same reasons. Inflation and overprinting of money, political upheaval within the society due to those inflationary pressures on the poor, and losing a major war to the up-and-coming new superpower. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to see all those signs going on around us right now, and Ray Dalio and many economists believe China will become the next superpower. I tend to disagree with that thesis because I just don't think they understand how unbelievably powerful our military is. U.S. most certainly has super weapons the general public is not aware of, and I can guarantee we have some aces up our sleeve that are yet to be revealed, but world leaders are correct in assessing that China poses a serious threat to U.S. interests abroad. The unfortunate thing about that is that we're totally dependent on their manufacturing, so any conflict with them would leave store shelves emptied overnight. So we simply aren't even remotely prepared for that kind of war that seems almost inevitable. So what's the solution to all this? How do we avoid the collapse of our empire that is showing all the historical signs that we are on the brink of losing our power? And there is only one solution to our petty political disagreements: a peaceful social revolution by the people that forces our leaders to change their disastrous policies and turn to more logical economic and geopolitical actions. We need to take some plays out of the Martin Luther King and Gandhi playbook, and I quote Gandhi here: "Nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. It is mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of man." As a man who teaches survival and tactical-based skills, I can say that after 25 plus years of training in these skills, that while violence is often the most short-term effective solution, it's often the wrong one in the long run. We can't allow our leaders to divide us among political lines and divide us so that they can enact their agenda of control. We have to peacefully revolt and stand up to tyranny and ensure that our democracy lives on, because I think if we engage in violence amongst each other, it will be our ruin. I mean, we absolutely must stand united or we will fall divided. Our political disagreements are petty in general, and we are only focused on these issues because our lives are so easy right now. As the old saying goes, hard times creates hard men, easy times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And that's all I got for you guys today. Please share this video, and if you want some survival training, check out survivalschool.us. Thanks and have a great day.